I spoke with the former Israeli ambassador to Australia, Mark Sofer, about the significance of this step. Ambassador Mark Sofer, thank you for joining us on I-24 News. Australia already back in 2003 had designated the military side of Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. Why do you think it's finally gotten around to giving that designation also to its so-called political wing?
Well, as you know, Kalev, Australia is a very close and dear friend of Israel, basically almost across the entire political spectrum. So the issue here wasn't ideological or wasn't political, if you ask my personal or my frank opinion. I think it was more in the realm of bureaucracy and legal issues which were involved here. But at the end of the day, Australia and Israel basically operating on the same wavelength entirely. And as I said, the vast majority of the body politic in Australia saw the Hezbollah in its entirety as a terrorist organization. It was just a question of time until it was put into practice as part of the terrorist list that they have.
Right, on the same wavelength, but not entirely, because Hamas, like many countries, Australia is still making that differential between, as I say, its military wing and its so-called political wing. So can we expect action to be taken also on Hamas as well?
Well, I hope so. I think that the British decision will certainly a move which will encourage such a move on behalf of the Australians. As I said, Australia is part and parcel of the Western camp, a very close and dear friend of Israel, and there's no harbinger there's no problems as far as the ideological approach to the Hezbollah or to the Hamas, and so really it's a question of movement in a number of other fields, especially the legal one.
Now, let's move beyond Australia for a moment. Ambassador Sofer, you're a veteran diplomat. You've been posted in many nations. I wonder if you could talk about the efforts of the foreign ministry internationally to get nations to understand that there's really little differentiation between the so-called military and political wings of such terror groups as Hezbollah and Hamas.
Well, as you know, the Foreign Ministry, and I've been with it for 39 years. I retired a few months back after having been ambassador in Australia and India and Ireland and elsewhere. Some of them are extremely close to Israel, others perhaps less so, and you understand what I'm saying here. But having said that, I think that the ongoing efforts on behalf of the Foreign Ministry, and Israel in general, just not just the Foreign Ministry, but mainly the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to get the international community to recognize the Hamas and the Hezbollah for what they really are, has been ongoing for many years. And I think that the problem with the Hezbollah, to a certain extent, has been their involvement inside of the Lebanese government. And that how does one distinguish between banning a part of a government and discussions with the government itself? That's an issue which I think a lot of countries are grappling with. But it's moving, and the effort, as I said, has been ongoing for many years now. And as you see, the results, they come. It's not a quick fix. Nothing is. But there are very, very many countries in the world which view terrorism in the same way that Israel does. We're not alone in this by any means. And as a result of that, I'm actually quite optimistic that other countries, especially in the Western camp, will join. And time will tell.
Briefly, let's talk a little about the practical impact of this move, because in many cases we're talking, yes, about funding or fundraising that groups like Hezbollah and Hamas do abroad.
Well, I think that's you've touched perhaps the major, certainly one of the major issues. I think the issues of funding are crucial. There's a lot of so-called charitable organizations which belong in one form or another to terrorist organizations, or so-called charitable organizations. And the bottom line is, of course, that charitable status admits them to transfer funding from local sources. That funding will be cut off, of course, in Australia, and they've been very careful anyway to ensure that none of the money coming from Australia moves towards any type of terrorist organization anyway. But I think that that's crucial. Another issue, of course, is the security issue itself, not just the funding. None of these countries want any terrorist activity on their soil, but not just on their soil, actually, against their interests abroad. Many of them have troops in the region. Many of them have, or all of them have embassies and missions abroad, and they are flung throughout the world. It hasn't been all that many years, and all of us remember that the Hezbollah has been active in Argentina and other countries in which they've perpetrated terrorist incidents, and so nobody is immune. Right. And that's why I tend to be optimistic as to the continuation of the recognition by other forward-looking countries in this vein.
Ambassador Mark Sulfer, thank you for joining us on I-24
Thank
News.
you very much indeed.